From London, I'm John Weeks, and this is The Standard.
It's all to play for. I think it's going to be a close election, a close two-horse race. It's really important. Those Londoners that want to help me build a fairer, greener, safe London vote tomorrow and vote Labour.
Vote, because it's so essential. We have got to get Sadiq Khan out of City Hall, and the only way we can do that is to be voting on Thursday. I'm the only one that can beat him, so please, if you want to see an end of Sadiq Khan, then please vote for me.
The final messages from London's two main mayoral candidates, Sadiq Khan and Susan Hall, ahead of the vote tomorrow. Yesterday afternoon, it was looking pretty good for Sadiq, as a YouGov poll showed he had a 22-point lead over Ms Hall. But the latest poll by Savanta released this morning, which used a different methodology, put Sadiq just 10 points ahead of Susan, the smallest lead he's had since campaigning began. It suggests that the race has tightened in the last few days before polling day and provides an interesting end to this year's election. But how accurate are the polls really? And how can they show such different results? Joining me now to explain all is our political editor, Nicholas Cecil. So Nick, we've had two sets of poll results in the last 24 hours, or less than 24 hours. What are those poll results each saying?
So the Savanta poll has shown a 10-point lead for Mr. Khan. We had a poll yesterday by YouGov, and they put the lead for Mr. Khan at 22 points. Now, those are clearly very different results. The pollsters use different methodologies to come to their findings. It's particularly hard to carry out polls in smaller areas, for example, a city, compared to a national poll to get that result right for various reasons. So these polls, we've got to take them with some caution. And certainly if you speak to Labour MPs or Tory MPs, they all expect the result to be far closer than 20 points or so. And if you look at what happened in the last mayoral contest between Sean Bailey and Sadiq Khan in April 2021, there was a poll literally a month before that election day, and that put Mr. Khan about 20 points ahead. The final result was half that. So certainly Labour are very nervous when they see a 10-point gap, because it means that theoretically Susan Hall could win. Susan Hall's camp will no doubt be buoyed by this latest finding, but still she's got, it appears, some ground to make up in the very final days of this contest. We've got a couple of things for this election which could make quite a significant difference, which means people think actually this race could be even closer than it might seem at this stage. So the mayoral election this year is being decided by the first past the post electoral system. And this is different from previous mayoral contests. And it's not clear how people who previously might have put their first preference for the Lib Dems, the Greens, or another party, what they will do. Will they carry on doing that, or will they decide instead to back one of the two candidates most likely to win, Mr. Khan and Ms. Hall? The other thing that we've got this year for the first time in London is the use of photo ID, which will be required to take part in the elections. If you don't turn up with a suitable type of photo ID, you'll not be allowed to vote. This new requirement has been controversial because while everyone can use their passport or driving license, all those forms of documentation are allowed. For older people can use their Oyster 60 Plus card, but younger voters aren't able to use their Oyster 18 Plus card. So there's some controversy there about this new photo ID requirement.
That's it. And as you say, the polls only tell us so much. I mean, in your vast experience, Nick, just how accurate a measure are they of the public's thinking?
They are very hard to do polls at a smaller regional level compared to a national poll. Also, with national polls, you have lots of data because they're done very, very regularly. So they're broadly reliable. For polls in a city like London, there's less data to go back to, and you've got to decide how you weight it. Do you weight that to the last mayoral election, or do you weight that to the last national election? Both systems have their benefits and disadvantages. So it's quite hard this to do, and we'll find out on the weekend what the final result really is.
And you said you reckon Susan Hall and her team will be buoyed by the latest poll results. But how much do you think the candidates are concerned with the polls throughout the process, really?
Oh, well, they may say that they don't look at them, but of course they do, and their campaign teams do as well. And certainly, I think what's clear from the polls we've had or so, about maybe a dozen or so during this contest, that they do appear to have tightened. So Susan Hall appears to have gained some ground on Mr. Khan. One possible reason for this is that if you ask people in London how they're going to vote in the mayoral contest several months out, pollsters believe that actually what Londoners will respond is largely, or in many cases, what their Westminster voting intentions are for the Westminster Parliament, i.e., are they more favourable to Labour or to the Tories? But as the election for the mayor gets closer, when they start getting leaflets from the various candidates through their door, maybe get their postal vote or voting cards as well through the post, then they start focusing more on the actual choice at hand, whether they want Sadiq Khan or Susan Hall to be the capital's next mayor. And then that's why the results may shift over time.
And most, if not all, of the polls so far have had one thing in common: a Sadiq Khan victory. Do you think Sadiq will win?
It's always difficult to call election before they happen. Certainly what Savanta are saying is that they're still predicting, in their words, a broadly comfortable victory for Mr. Khan. So the polls point to Mr. Khan winning, but at this stage, you can't rule out a shock victory for Miss Hall.
Time for a quick break now. In part 2, our City Hall editor Ross Lydall discusses some of the final day drama ahead of tomorrow's vote.
Their advertising van delivery driver didn't set his alarm clock and didn't get out of bed on time, so Sadiq ended up with this rather embarrassing situation.
I'm now joined by our City Hall editor Ross Lydall. Ross, the final day before voting, you've been spending some time with Sadiq Khan today. How are things in his camp this morning?
Well, the biggest news from Sadiq's camp this morning is that their advertising van delivery driver didn't set his alarm clock and didn't get out of bed on time. So Sadiq ended up with this rather embarrassing situation where he'd summoned the media to Embankment for 7 a.m. for his 7:30 a.m. arrival. And not only were we sort of standing in the cold awaiting the mayor, but also were a handful of primary school children, some of which had come all the way from Crouch End down to central London to join his sort of last day election stunt, because what Sadiq was doing was unveiling this advert on the side of one of these digital ad vans, basically plugging his free school meals policy, and all these kids were ready to sort of jump up and down alongside him and wave flags. But alas, the van didn't turn up in time. So certainly by the time I left at 8:30 to come into the Standard office to actually write my story for today's paper, there was no sign of the van. And as far as I know, the kids had to rush back because otherwise, the school bell goes at 9 o'clock and some of these kids would have some explaining to do. And quite whether I was kept late by the mayor would go down well with the headmaster at sort of Coleridge Primary School in Crouch End, I'm not sure, but it's almost like, if you think about the children's books, where is Tiddler? Well, Tiddler was kept waiting by Sadiq's dozy delivery driver or dozy advertising driver. So not the best of lunches. What was obviously a bit funny as well was Sadiq denied all knowledge of this. I asked him, what's happened to your ad van? And he said, what ad van? What are you talking about? I think he knew exactly what was happening, and it was all a bit red-faced from the red side of London, shall we say, this morning.
Yeah, just a bit of a shocker there. Have there been any similar sort of gaffes almost in the past when it's come to sort of the final day or the campaign trail for the mayoral election?
Well, as we all know, Susan Hall, the Tory candidate, is not immune to gaffes. Normally she makes these on social media, but she has been sort of keeping her fingers off Twitter or X for quite some time now, and it feels like her Twitter account has been taken over by some party apparatchiks because it's been sort of dull as ditch water and no classic Susie Howlers or, often, or certainly in the minds of the Labour side of town, is something often more inflammatory. I put this to her when I actually managed to track her down yesterday in Dagenham. They invited me over to Dagenham at sort of midday with the promise of having another ride on her rather lovely Routemaster battle bus. Unfortunately, the battle bus went on elsewhere, and I was left to interview Susan on a rather windy, characterless street in Dagenham, having sort of taken a good couple of hours out of my day to get there and back. The previous day, the battle bus had been unveiled in Wallington, in deepest, darkest Sutton, and it immediately drove straight into a cul-de-sac to be greeted by a band of rather, shall we say, extreme or hardline ULEZ activists, who perhaps it might not have been the wisest thing for Susan to be pictured alongside. One of the more notorious chaps gave her a bear hug. This battle bus then sort of stayed there for an hour or so. It's exempt from the ULEZ. Many people were asking, is it actually ULEZ compliant? Because it's more than 50 years old, it doesn't actually have to pay the ULEZ, even though obviously the engine won't meet Sadiq's preferred standards. But the day or two before, when Susan unveiled her own advertising vehicle, I was able to find out that was also in breach of the ULEZ, and she actually had to pay £12.50 that day for it to drive around town, because that did not comply with the exhaust regulations. So perhaps not the best look, although Susan obviously is opposed to the ULEZ expansion. It may not be the best look to actually pollute the lungs of Londoners when you're asking for their votes.
And it all comes down to tomorrow's vote, Ross. As we know, the polls have tipped Sadiq to secure a third term, which will be a bit of an historic moment anyway. If he doesn't do it, just how big a shock will it be?
Well, this will be the worst day for the Reds since Jurgen Klopp announced he was leaving Liverpool. If Sadiq Khan does not win a third term, it will be a massive upset. It will be a massive blow also to Keir Starmer, the Labour Party leader, and could throw into doubt whether actually Labour will ever be able to command a majority in the House of Commons. Should Sadiq lose and Susan Hall win, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, will have a smile on his face as wide as the River Thames. It really is almost unthinkable. It's not impossible. Shocks do happen, and it could be that these polls have completely misjudged the mood in London, and particularly in outer London. Now, Susan Hall always to me feels an honest woman. She told me months ago that she thought she would win, almost in a slightly surprised way. And this was just down to her meeting people in outer London, knocking on doors. She denies now that she's concentrated on the sort of donut strategy of only targeting outer London. She says she's visited all boroughs at least twice. But I asked her the other day whether she still genuinely believed that she could win, and she said, yes, she honestly does. It wasn't perhaps said with the same sort of vim and sort of vigour as she said previously, when she seemed almost frightened at the prospect of becoming mayor. But I think we can't rule it out, but it would be unlikely, looking at the numbers. Obviously Nick has told us about the current poll today showing Sadiq 10 points ahead of Susan. There was one yesterday which said Sadiq was going to claim 47% of the vote. Now, that is a completely bonkers number, and if that comes true, then I will happily eat my cycle helmet live on your podcast, John. Because that would mean that Sadiq would do better than he's ever done, and this would be for a third term, and it would mean Susan would do worse than any Tory mayoral candidate has ever done. Now, the latter is not impossible. It may be that Susan is simply not Londoners' cup of tea, but for Sadiq to essentially go from 40% back in 2021. He got 44% when he first stood in 2016. So his vote went down last time. For it then to shoot back up to 47%, well, I'll look mighty silly on Saturday if I'm wrong, but I think my cycle helmet will be remaining intact.
Pick up the Evening Standard newspaper for more news, interviews and analysis, or head to standard.co.uk. Thanks for listening. The Standard podcast is back tomorrow.